about LIBOR. We then had one last year, which was we switched to focus to loans when Claire Dawson, the CEO from the Loan Market Association, and also Alice Connolly from the Reserve Bank provided a focus for us. And the big question then is that why is this topic so important for an Australian lawyer? Why is the London interbank offer rate something that we will spend a lot of time on? And there are two big things to look at. The first one is there's approximately $350 trillion worth of financial contracts which are valued off LIBOR. And LIBOR is due to end by the end of next year. So next year, so there will be a lot of work done on transition across from contracts based on LIBOR to the alternatives, which we call risk-free rates. Third, as on Friday, ISDA published a new set of definitions and a protocol, which are very important, not just for the swap market, but also the loan market and also for bonds. So it's very good timing in that regard. We have an expert panelist here today. We've got Andrea Brachetto from the Reserve Bank. Andrea is the Deputy Head of Domestic Markets, and she also has holds a Master of Economics from the London School of Economics and a Bachelor of Economics from University of Queensland. Ironically, there are three people on this panel today. He studied at the University of Queensland back in the mid to early 90s. We also had Jing Gu from the Head of Legal for ISDA for the Asia Pacific. Jing is unusual in that most lawyers are happy with one postgraduate law degree. Jing not only has one, but three Masters of Laws from three different jurisdictions in the US, in Japan, and also in China, which is a great testament to her flexibility, and technical expertise, which you need in ISDA, considering the amount of jurisdictions that Jing has to cover. We also had John Feeney. I worked with John for many years when he was at NAB. John is a former trader at Macquarie, CBA, and also National Australia Bank. Was the head of pricing at NAB, and also set up the NAB LIBOR program. And he's a former board member for ISDA, but is now a partner at a firm called Marshallers. John is unusual in that he has he's a former trader with a PhD in chemistry, but he is able to explain complicated financial markets in a way that even lawyers can understand. So it's great to have John here. Last but certainly not least is Dale Rayner. Dale has worked for many firms, including commercial roles in HSBC and also SocGen. Dale is fairly unique in that he can cover multiple asset classes. There aren't many lawyers who's presented at ISDA conferences, loan market conferences, and also BFSLA. So it's great to have Dale here for the seminar. So, but the first big issue is why we're here, what is LIBOR, and what are risk-free rates, and what we need to do. And John, can you just provide us with a context as to the background and the big things to consider?
Yeah, one of the major issues that I'm sure that everybody deals with is the fact that LIBOR, being such an important part of the fabric of financial markets, and it is very, very heavily referred to in many financial contracts. The issue is that although we do actually have fallbacks for LIBOR embedded in most of our contracts, the problem is many of those are not necessarily all that helpful in the case of a permanent cessation of LIBOR. So as we know, the FCA has indicated that they won't be using their ability to compel banks to submit to LIBOR post 2021. So that effectively means the end of LIBOR, as we know. So you can't, and if you're trying to look at fallbacks, if they're not terribly effective and they can't really continue on, particularly in the case of, say, a 50-year derivative, then you need to have a better way of dealing with this thing. So the way in which that was dealt with, certainly from a derivatives perspective, and more broadly through loans, syndicated loans, debt issues, is that you really do need to find a better fallback for it, which are collectively often referred to as risk-free rates, so RFR. So they're based on cash. Okay, so instead of looking at something which actually has a term structure to it, like LIBOR has a 1 month, 3 months, 6 months. You're looking at an overnight rate based on cash. And these markets are quite deep and liquid. And generally speaking, the benchmarks that are associated with them are compiled by central banks from actual data. So a risk-free rate is really an effective and robust way you can replace LIBOR in financial contracts. Now, it's not easy. There's a couple of tricks to doing it, but at least there is a very, very clear and very understood way of actually being able to replace LIBOR when it eventually disappears, at least for the purposes of the use in most financial contracts. So that's what's happened. So we got here over a long period of time. It took a fair while for us to get here, but now we're with just a little over 12 months away. The pace is really picking up as to how to replace LIBOR with the risk-free rates in those contracts.
So, and John, quickly, are there any term risk-free rates?
Yeah, there are. So this is under development, and the first ones that have really been made available are the sterling term risk-free rates. So they're available in beta form, and they can be seen. You can access those through the Bank of England website if you like. I'll give you a link to get there. The US has just completed an RFP for the provision of a term risk-free rate in US dollars. Japan has completed its RFP, and they're in development phase at the moment for one based on toner. And the Europeans likewise have started a process to identify and provide a term risk-free rate as well. So instead of like using just an overnight rate, you can get something that looks a little bit more like LIBOR, like it come out in 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, 10, it's that type of thing. Okay, so yes, they're under development or in beta form.
Okay, but there's none which are widely used yet.
No, the beta runs out in February for the UK, and then they can be used from that point on. We fully expect sometime sort of early to mid next year, the same will be true for the US dollars and similar for the other currencies. So not usable yet, but very, very, they're not far away from being quite accessible.
Great, thanks, Sean. Andrew, the Reserve Bank has played a major role in the LIBOR transition and also advising banks and other firms that they must transition. What's the RBA's perspective on the transition, and what role do you think markets should play in assisting it?
Thanks, Karen. Look, from the Reserve Bank's perspective, our main message really is that the end of LIBOR is a certainty, and it is critical that Australian institutions, both financials and non-financials, are ready for the end of LIBOR by the end of next year. So that means by the end of 2021, institutions do need to have transitioned to use alternative reference rates. So that's the risk-free rates that John mentioned. And for contracts where that's not possible, at least have robust fallback provisions in place. So it's clear what the replacement rate will be when LIBOR ends. Now, this is important, not just from a company's own perspective, but for the financial system more broadly. So institutions that continue using LIBOR beyond the end of next year obviously face significant reputational, operational and legal risks themselves. But importantly, they also pose systemic risk because they risk disrupting financial markets more generally, which obviously has more far-reaching consequences. So readiness for LIBOR transition is something that the RBA is watching closely, and it is being monitored in a supervisory context by ASIC and APRA. And I think a fair summary of where we're at in Australia is, while we have seen progress on LIBOR transition in Australia to date, it's clear that continued focus and effort is going to be required. And ASIC has sent letters to the CEOs of major financial and corporate institutions on this issue. Now, that's the situation for LIBOR, but it is quite a different situation for our local credit-based benchmark, BBSW. And that's because, unlike LIBOR, BBSW does remain robust, We've still got an active bank bill market, and a lot of work has gone into strengthening the methodology underlying the benchmark calculation. So it's transaction-based and includes a robust waterfall. So the rate can still be calculated where transactions on any given day may not be sufficient. So given BBSW does remain robust, we are pursuing a multiple rate approach for our local reference rates in Australia. In other words, we're not advocating a wholesale transition to referencing the overnight risk-free rate, which is what's being done for LIBOR, as John mentioned. Instead, we expect market participants to choose a robust reference rate that makes most sense for their particular product and situation. So taking into account their own and their clients' needs or hedging strategies. Now, in some cases, referencing the risk-free rate, so in our case, that's the overnight cash rate or AONIA, as it's known in financial markets. In some cases, that will make more sense. Floating rate notes issued by governments, non-financial corporates and securitisation trusts are some examples here. But in other cases, a credit-based benchmark like BBSW will continue to make more sense for floating rate notes and corporate loans issued by banks, say. Now, it's also worth noting that for some products, approaches adopted widely by market participants offshore will have an important bearing on the reference rate we end up using here. So regardless of the robustness of BBSW, we are likely to see some shift towards referencing risk-free rates in Australia anyway. Now, the other thing we expect market participants to do, having chosen a robust reference rate, is to make sure they have robust contractual fallbacks in place in case that reference rate is discontinued. Now, increasing contract robustness by including robust fallback provisions is actually an important element of the broader program of global benchmark reform. And this applies regardless of whether it's LIBOR or some other reference rate being used. You know, if there's one thing that the LIBOR experience has shown us, it's that nothing can be guaranteed forever. And just to finish off, I did just want to make, I guess, one point about the forward-looking term risk-free rates that John mentioned. Yes, they're in development, which obviously is a welcome development from market participants' perspectives, because that will make transition a lot easier. But I think it's important to highlight it still is at this stage a risky transition strategy, and at least in the case of LIBOR, to wait for the emergence at some future uncertain date of a forward-looking term risk-free rate, which may or may not turn out to be sufficiently robust. So yes, they're in development, but you know, they're not there yet. There is still work to be done. So given LIBOR's imminent end date, market participants really should be preparing to use compounded overnight risk-free rates. So I might leave it there.
Okay, great. Thank you. And just a question back for John. So, and you used to be on the ISDA board. Can you describe the role that ISDA is playing in the for the wider market for the transition from LIBOR to alternative rates?
Yeah, the role ISDA plays is that the vast majority of the risk, okay, is when you measure it as gross notionals, is actually in derivatives. And so it's probably more important, you know, from a derivatives perspective, to make sure that you cater for that. So because a lot of the gross notionals, a lot of the contracts are derivatives based, if you like, ISDA was one of the earliest industry associations who was really out there trying to make some changes. The other thing that ISDA has going for it is the fact that its actual documentation is highly standardised and is used quite routinely throughout the market in standard form. Other things like loans, debt issues, this type of thing can be quite customised, and so their associations are going through what they call recommended language and changes. So the LMA, for instance, is looking at how they might incorporate you know, certain aspects into their documentation or their suggested documentation. Most non-derivative documentation groups, or ones who perhaps, you know, try to put out recommendations, such as the LMA, do admit though that it's sometimes the ISDA fallbacks are not entirely appropriate for their products for all people. So they do leave a little bit of option there for customization. Now, look, obviously it's better if you can make sure that everything is as standardized as possible, so that everything lines up nicely, but it's highly likely that will probably not occur. And so you just need to take some care to make sure that whatever you're looking at, particularly around the loans and debt space, that the fallbacks that are being included in new issues or fallbacks that are potentially going to be addressed in current issues, that if you're using derivatives to hedge them, that the two things are lined up. And that's basically the advice that I give quite a lot, because you can't take it for granted that will happen.
Okay, great, thanks. Before we move on to Jing for the ISDA, there's been a question which has been asked by someone about what, if any, are the risks and potential pitfalls associated with the risk-free rate. Andrea, are you able to respond to that question about, are there any things which people need to consider for using a risk-free rate which they wouldn't when they're on LIBOR? Or John, do you want to jump in?
Look, I think that comes back to the term issue that John was mentioning. So the risk-free rate, the ones available at the moment at least, are overnight rates. And so to get the sort of term concept in, you really do need to compound them in a backward-looking sense. And this is obviously different structurally to the forward-looking term rates that you get from the existing credit-based benchmarks like the IBORs like LIBOR and in Australia's case, BBSW. In terms of the pitfalls, I suppose, as I've already mentioned, the thing that LIBOR has shown us, I guess, is nothing is forever. There are risks with any rate in terms of its longevity. But one thing I would say in the case of the cash rate, so that's the speaking here for the risk-free rate in Australia, the RBA, as John mentioned again, the central bank is actually the administrator of the risk-free rate in Australia. And as the administrator, we have made sure that there is a robust waterfall in the cash rate procedures, so you can be assured of its robustness as a benchmark. This means it will continue to be published under a broad range of conditions, and it will reflect the interest rate relevant to unsecured overnight funds. And this would continue to be the case even in the absence of any market transactions on a particular day. So I guess as the administrator of that benchmark, at least, I can provide that assurance. But yeah, so maybe turn over to John for any other comments.
Yeah, just to add one or two comments. Where a lot of actual end users have more difficulty with regard to risk-free rates and the compounding process is exactly that. It's systems and processes. Systems can be fixed relatively quickly. That's an IT problem, right? Processes are completely different. So where you've got things like accounting, accrual, simply calculating the dirty price of a floating rate note is not trivial when you don't know what the next coupon's going to be. Okay, so by not knowing the actual rate until the end of the relevant period is actually quite often a process problem for a lot of people. So that's one of the biggest things you look at, to be honest. It's a systems, yeah, I can kind of get my head around IT, but the processes prove to be much less tractable as an issue. Okay, so think about that in a more holistic way about how the move from knowing the rate at the beginning, the relevant period, to not knowing it until the end, how that's going to impact everything that you do all the way through your processes, whether you're a corporate or whether you're an investor or indeed a bank. It is actually going to have some fairly fundamental changes. So that's the only bit I could add, I think.
Right. Okay, thanks, John. Okay, so what we'll do, we'll go to Jing now to talk about ISDA, and this has been a 4-year journey, Jing, which has consumed a lot of time, a lot of effort. Can you just describe what the journey has been on, and also the solutions that they're proposing?
Thank you, Karen. So as Karen has mentioned, ISDA has been working on the contractual fallbacks for nearly 4 years. So this has involved complex technical work in collaboration with industry and regulators on the adjustment that would be applied to a risk-free rate. So it could replace an IBOR as a reference rate without materially changing the original objective of the transaction. So as Karen mentioned, ISTA published the IBOR fallback protocol last Friday, on October 23. We've also launched the supplement, IBOR fallback supplement, the same day. So where fallbacks should not be used as a primary means of transitioning to the RFRs, they will act as a critical safety net and risk mitigant, ensuring contracts that continue to reference IBOR switch to the adjusted RFR fallback if an IBOR ceases to exist, or in the case of LIBOR rate option, is deemed by the UK FCA to be non-representative of its underlying market. So in the next possibly 5 or 7 minutes, I will just fly through some of the key takeaways for the IBOR fallback protocol and supplement. One thing to note is that those two documents are fairly complicated. So when we were drafting the fallbacks for the IBORs covered by the ISTA documentation, all the central banks were heavily involved in reviewing the fallbacks for their respective benchmarks. So Andrea from RBA, together with her colleagues, commented on the BBSW fallback quite a few times. And obviously, ISTA is very grateful for the input of the members and also the central banks in the process. Just to start with a question about why are changes to the fallbacks necessary, I think John has alluded to this. So if you look at the current 2006 ISTA definitions, which actually are used for both centrally cleared and non-centrally cleared OTC derivative transactions, the definitions generally require the calculation agent of a transaction to go out to do a dealer's poll, essentially to get the quotations for the reference rate if the rate is not published on the specific time on the specific date, for the party's transaction. So obviously this is not ideal because you can imagine if LIBOR ceases to be published, the major dealers would be unveiling or unable to give such codes, and even they're waiting to give the codes, and the codes could change materially across the market, therefore create basis risk. And for that reason, ISTA started to work with OSSG from 2016 to come up with a set of fallback provisions to improve the contractual robustness of interest rate derivatives. Just a quick word on what are covered under the IBOR fallback supplement and protocol. The ISTA fallback documents cover 13 floating rate options. So there are 5 LIBOR currencies. In addition to that, we also cover TIBOR in Japan, BBSW in Australia, HIBOR in Hong Kong, and SOR in Singapore, and Thai baht fix used in Thailand, as well as Euribor. So among the 13 floating rate options, the fallback rates for the 11 floating rate options will be published by Bloomberg, which has been selected as ISTA's fallback adjustment window. And for the 2 additional fallback rate for SOR used in Singapore and Thai baht fix in Thailand, the fallback rates will be published by ABS, which is administrator of the Singapore swap offer rate, and Bank of Thailand, which is a central bank, but also the administrator of the Thai benchmark, Thai baht fix. The reason of that, if you look at the documents, there are certain provisions which are only applicable to SOR and Thai baht fix, and there are provisions which are applicable to the other 11 floating rate option. And the reason is because fundamentally, the benchmarks, the 2 Asian benchmarks are different because they are the FX swap implied rate. In other words, the benchmarks, taking Singapore as example, SOR has 2 components. One is US dollar LIBOR, and one is the Sing dollar and US dollar FX swap. So therefore, the administrator will be taking the fallback rate for dollar LIBOR and plug that number into their existing calculation methodology and add in the FX swap points to calculate the fallback rate for SOAR. So just to sort of highlight this difference between the different floating rate options. Next, what I want to mention in the IST fallback supplement, the changes are made to section 7.1 of the 2006 IST definitions. So the amended floating rate options will generally include the existing price sales information and a statement identifying the objective triggers for permanent cessation or pre-cessation that would activate the selected fallbacks, and also a description of the fallback that will apply upon the occurrence of the trigger, which will be the adjusted RFR plus a spread adjustment. So the amendments will be implemented where a supplement to the 2006 is the definition. So upon the effective date of the supplement, which is scheduled to be Jan 25 next year, and then all new transactions that incorporate the 2006 IST definitions will include the fallbacks. In other words, the counterparties will not have to take any additional steps. So your contracts will automatically include those fallbacks. But however, the transactions that incorporate the 2006 IST definitions entered prior to the effective date, again, Jan 25 next year, those are generally referred as legacy trades, or the transactions that incorporate other interest rate definitions, such as the 2000 IST definitions, which is a previous version of the interest rate definitions. Those would not automatically include the fallbacks. In order to amend your legacy trades to be consistent with your new trades, IST published this IBOR fallback protocol to facilitate multilateral amendments to include the fallbacks in legacy trades. So by adhering to the protocol, market participants would agree their legacy trades with other adherents will include amended floating rate options for the relevant IBOR and will therefore include the fallback. As always, IST's protocol will be voluntary and will amend the contracts only between two parties, both of which have signed up to the IST protocol. So the fallbacks included in the legacy trades by adherence to the protocol will be exactly the same as the fallbacks included in new transactions that incorporate the 2006 IST definitions. Another thing to note is that the IST IBOR protocol's coverage is fairly wide. So it will cover not only IST master agreements, IST credit support documents and confirmations, it will also cover some of the non-IST master agreements, credit support documents, and confirmations which supplements forms part of or is subject to the non-IST master agreements. So the list of non-IST documents are listed in annex to the IST protocol. So you can flip to the page and to see clearly what non-IST documentation are covered by the protocol. For example, JMRA, which is widely used in repos transaction, is covered. JMSLA, which is used for securities lending transaction in the international markets, is also covered by the IST protocol, as well as a number of the derivatives master agreements used locally in certain jurisdictions are also covered by the protocol. Regarding just one word regarding the clear trades. So typically the clearing houses also use 2006 IST definitions for when it comes to centrally cleared RS. So for the new trades, the same thing, because they use 2006 definitions, the new trades will centrally cleared trades will also include the fallbacks. As to the legacy trades, which are cleared through CCPs, the CCPs actually have the power to, in their rulebooks, to implement those fallbacks in all of their legacy trades. So therefore, in other words, both cleared and non-centrally cleared trades will also be the same when it comes to IBOR fallback arrangements. Another thing I do want to mention briefly is also what's the trigger for the fallback to apply. So obviously you have this nicely drafted document sets out all the complicated legal provisions. But I guess for lawyers, the question number one is when is the time I need to look into those provisions. It's triggered by permanent discontinuation of relevant IBOR. So for BBSW, it is triggered by the permanent discontinuation of BBSW. However, for the LIBOR rate options, which means the 5 LIBOR currencies, plus SOR and Thai baht fix, which are also linked to dollar LIBOR, they will have additional trigger, which is we call referred as precession. So essentially, if FCA comes out to say LIBOR says to be representative, that would also trigger the IBOR fallback provisions for the LIBOR currencies. For the regarding the application of the fallback, the fallback provisions will be triggered, as I mentioned, upon the permanent cessation of the relevant IBOR or non-representativeness for LIBOR. But they will only apply when actually the LIBOR or IBOR says to be published. So taking example, if UK FCA announced next year, let's say Jan 2021, saying LIBOR will cease to be published in Jan 2022, and the fallback will only start to apply to your contracts in Jan 2022. Before I hand it over back to Karen, I think I've been going on for quite some time, is that what's the fallback methodology? Very quickly, East has done quite a few consultations, and the method chosen by market participants is compounded setting arrears and a 5-year historic media approach to the spread adjustment. So for each IBOR currency and each tenor covered by the ISTA documentation, if you go to the Bloomberg website, you will see 3 numbers being published by Bloomberg on an indicative basis as of now. So these 3 numbers are adjusted FR, compounded setting arrears for each RFR, for each relevant IBOR tenor, the spread adjustment calculated based on the media historic differences between the IBOR and the compounded RFR and the all-in fallback rate. They're indicative because the fallbacks, they were published on the basis if the index cessation event happened today. So when the LIBOR actually ceases to be published, let's say when the index cessation event occurs, when FCA makes an announcement, that's the day when the spread will be fixed and crystallized. So I will pause here and then hand it over to Karen.
Okay, thanks, Jing. One more before you go. BKBN wasn't included in the first round. Is that being addressed in a second round of definition changes?
Yes, it will be. So New Zealand is very similar to Australia in a sense. They have no plan to discontinue BKBM, but they do want the market participants to implement contractual fallback for BKBM, which is the official cash rate. So this the fallback rate was announced in Jan this year by the central bank in New Zealand. So we're working with the central bank in New Zealand to implement the fallback for BKBM. So currently we will be looking at sometime next year to implement it, together with several other benchmarks in other APAC jurisdictions such as the Philippines, India, and Malaysia. And the fallback rate for BKBM will also be published by Bloomberg.
Great, thank you. Thanks for that. Andrea, the Australian regulators made an announcement a few weeks ago about supporting the adherence to the protocol. Can you just provide a bit of a background as to what was said and what's expected for Australian participants?
Yeah, thanks, Karen. So look, as we've been discussing, fallbacks are going to play an important role in the orderly transition away from LIBOR in the cases where transition to alternative reference rates for legacy contracts isn't feasible. And this is why ASIC, APRA and the Reserve Bank are strongly encouraging Australian institutions that use derivatives contracts referencing LIBOR to review and, wherever practical, adhere to the ISTA protocol by its effective date of 25th of January next year. So it is our strong expectation that wherever practical, Australian institutions will be adhering. And I'm pleased to say the RBA has already adhered to the protocol ourselves. So that's, I mean, that really is the message. And I guess the other just follow up there is, once again, a reminder that fallbacks also provide important future insurance, which is worth having even for contracts that reference other currently robust benchmark rates, such as BBSW. So as Jing mentioned, BBSW is covered in the fallbacks and the protocol. So that's obviously another reason to adhere.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, and Dale, question for you. Are we expecting, also, what sort of expectation is there amongst, say, the customers you deal with on the hearing? Is this the sort of thing that people do without thinking too much about, and what are these sort of pitfalls for them?
Yeah, thanks, Karen. Hi, everyone. So in terms of the protocol, I mean, it's obviously a great outcome to have that sort of multilateral amendment, which means effectively, as Ding has mentioned, anything referring to the 2006 definitions will suddenly be amended to include the protocols and the protocol fallbacks and how that's all set up. I guess in terms of an individual decision to sign up to the protocol, it is it's a great sort of one-size-fits-all solution, but that also means it needs to be viewed with some caution in the sense of where documents are finance linked, where the swap is actually related to some other cash flow or a particular cash product, then regard will still need to be had to whether or not it's an appropriate fallback mechanism and whether its timing and the rates that were ultimately produced by that match the deal underneath. And we'll talk later, I think, about some of the other cash products and where they're headed in terms of their fallbacks. But helpfully, ISDA has also produced some bilateral documentation, which would allow people to perhaps not do the protocol in all cases, but you can actually amend it so that certain trades are not inside it, and then you can do a bilateral agreement which picks up the relevant parts of the protocol, or maybe adjusts things so that in some cases it follows fallbacks in a cash product, so that you still have the matching. Because one of the key things for people to remember is if you sign the one-size-fits-all approach, it may not fit all of your cash products. So although it's a very quick thing to sign up to, there is still that review to be done around timing, which fallbacks turn up at what times and what they will do, relative to what they were originally trying to hedge, in the cash products. There's some very obviously intricately linked hedging agreements with, securitization transactions or project finance transactions and things like that. So for those, there might be a need to look more at bilateral arrangements, as well as that for people with a very small sort of hedging sort of book, they might be more interested in taking the long form bilateral and pulling it down into something that's just relevant to them instead of what people will see when they first look at the protocol. It's a fairly long and complex document. So that's obviously important for people to remember, because across all of this, I guess the ideal is to get the matching they had before, where they've got fully hedged cash products, and not to have that basis risk open up between one instrument and another. The protocol has a defined way, and we'll probably talk later about the cash products, which is they're not always operating the same way.
Okay, great. So, thanks, Dale. Before we move on to the cash products, just quickly, John, first question is for RFRs. Are people using RFRs for new transactions, especially on swaps? And we also have another question about the difficult issue of cross-currency swaps and what impact that is likely to have for liquidity in Australia.
Yeah, sure. So firstly, what sort of progress is being made in order to move from LIBOR to risk-free rates in those critical currencies, particularly sterling and US dollars? The simple answer is that if you look at the raw numbers, it looks like the notionals, certainly in the case of sterling, seem to have shifted quite significantly in favour of the risk-free rate, SONIA. However, if you look at it in a bit more detail, I really recommend people do this, is that if you're trying to track it, there are two ways of doing it. The actual risk, which is referred to as DVO1, so discounted value of 1 basis point effectively, shows that there's still LIBOR transactions still dominate the market in both those currencies. The second one is that critical 2-year plus area of the market, so that risk-free rate has been very much dominated by short-term trading for many, many years, because these things have in general been around for a long time. The problem is that the critical 2-year plus, which is the hedge market, So people hedging loans or, hedging debt or doing whatever they're doing out there, but typically, 2-3 years plus, okay? And if you look at that, the risk-free rate impact is not very high in those critical currencies. In particular, US dollars, it's only about 4% of the market so far. So I'd watch that. Best place to do it, here's an easy one. Go to the ISDA website, and they're doing a great tracking, an index for this called the RFR Index in association with Claris Financial Technology. So you go to the Claris site, go to Claris FT, have a look under products, and it's updated once a month. And it's got some great graphs there that you can play around with. So in short, headline, yeah, there seems to be a bit of progress, but the reality is in that it's critical areas where you're going to see hedging being done by end users. No, we're not seeing a lot of progress just yet. I've been writing about this for coming up to 2 years, saying it's about to happen. And I really think 2021, it's got to happen. So you'll probably see the rush from one side of the room to the other side of the room sometime early or mid next year, I hope. So keep an eye on that. Cross-currency swaps, to do with your other question. I noticed there's something on the chat on that as well. Yeah, that's a tricky one because obviously with cross-currency swaps, you've got legs in different currencies. So there's no suggestion that both of them are going to trigger at the same time. So for instance, if you're doing Australian dollars, so BFSW versus US dollar LIBOR on the US dollar side will trigger. Okay, there's no doubt that will happen. But BFSW, as Andrea rightly pointed out, can continue on for quite a long time. So there is talk in the market about optionally, if one side goes, then the other side goes with it. Most of the market participants have indicated, so most of the big dealers have indicated that the liquid market will be risk-free rate to risk-free rate. So think SOFA, Sonia, okay, to Aonia, not necessarily BFSW. So the impact on liquidity for Australian users may well be driven by the large dealers who are not Australian. Okay, so the guys who dominate this market, okay, the cross-currency market are generally US and to some degree European banks. So if they decide to move to risk-free rates, that's the way the market goes. So just be aware of the liquidity issues that may actually pop up in there. And you may be seeing documentation with that sort of style in there. So try and look for these double, if one side triggers, the other side goes with it. And also documentation that starts to refer more to Aonia in cross-currency swaps rather than BFSW. It seems to be the direction of the traffic here.
Okay, great. Thank you. And just quickly, I know I've got 50 minutes left, is the issue activity in the floating rate notes or RFRs? Yeah,
funny. I was just getting most recent information up on the screen, as it turns out, Karen.
Yep.
So breaking news, nothing.
Okay.
That's the downside.
Okay.
Obviously, it's been a bit tricky over COVID-19, but the fact of the matter is on SOFA linked, so US dollar linked, it's the cumulative is increasing. So at the moment, it's getting close to the sort of 800 billion, which is a fairly decent chunk, but in total size of the US dollar issuance market, it's tiny, right? So remember, most of the issuance is in fixed rate anyway. So the reason why I connect that back to the swaps is that a lot of people who issue in fixed rate will swap to floating rate. So if you watch what they're swapping it into at the moment, they're swapping it into LIBOR. They're not swapping it into SOFA. If I then look at a little bit further down and I have a look and say, okay, Sonia, how's that one going? Again, it's sitting at around a sort of 60 billion of floating rate note issuance at the moment, and that's plateaued. So it looks like there's been no really substantial net issuance since about April. So there's been things bringing a few things starting up, but generally speaking, the market is creeping up, but it's not completely replacing. The other thing to watch out for, apart from FRNs, look out for capital instruments. You'll see those a fair bit. So by that I mean things like hybrids and perpetuals are problematic in this particular instance, mainly because of the structures in which they sit. So that's the other one I keep an eye on as well.
Okay, great, thanks. So that then means that there will be a lot of floating rate notes that need to transition. Dale, can you describe the complexities, especially for lawyers working on these deals, on the what will happen if they don't have updated fullbacks?
Yeah, so the floating rate notes, I guess they're a bit of a special case because obviously they're not as easy to amend as your regular bilateral loans and some of the other cash products. And if you did a survey of the market, you'd find that, variously they might either go to a sort of dealer submission as their interest rate, which is one of the conventions the US notes have, or sometimes they just go back to the day before, so the last published rate if there is a discontinuance, which effectively turns your floating rate note into a fixed rate note forevermore. So neither of those options really are going to work for a permanent discontinuance. Even taking dealer bids, as Jing mentioned earlier, it doesn't really work in a constant environment where there's no other rate being published for that currency. So those are also proving very difficult to transition because in US bonds, for example, it's 100% in a lot of cases voter consent to get the amendments through regarding interest rate. And in most others, it's at least 75. So it's a real lingering sort of issue around how to make that transition for those. And we'll sort of talk about tough legacy issues later, but that definitely is a special class that will have to be dealt with separately in a way because it's very hard to make these changes to the legacy notes. Obviously, for notes going forward, it's really important to get an architecture in there now to transition to the new rates, which I think the market has responded to. Some notes are out there saying it'll be whatever the swap says. Obviously, there are some innovative solutions out there, but certainly amending the existing notes that are out there, the $350 trillion worth of them, that is actually going to be a big challenge.
Okay, thanks, Dale. And Andrea, with the floating rate notes, Aussie dollar floating rate notes, so the RBA has come out with some statements on the fallbacks for these ones. Can you describe what they are?
We have. So look, I guess 2 points to make in relation to BBSW floating rate notes. The first is, look, as I've already noted, we are adopting a multiple rate approach. So, we're not mandating shift to risk-free rates just because, BBSW does remain robust in most cases. But I think what is important to highlight is that not all BBSW tenors are as robust as others. So in particular, the 1 month BBSW is already largely a buyback market and is less liquid than the other tenors. So users of 1 month BBSW really should be considering using alternative benchmarks given the lack of liquidity in this market. So that's first key message in this area. The second one is, more generally, given the importance of robust fallbacks as future insurance in all contracts, the RBA will be requiring securities that reference BBSW of any tenor to include the relevant ISDA fallback provisions in order to be eligible collateral in our market operations. Now, as has already been mentioned, a lot of good work is already going on in industry towards developing market conventions in this area. And now that the ISDA fallbacks have been launched, we will be consulting market participants in the period ahead on how we're going to implement these new requirements. So the exact timing and scope of what we will be requiring. And in this process, we are mindful, as already been mentioned, it is I guess more difficult to amend floating rate notes to get these fallbacks in. So we will be conscious of weighing up the costs and benefits involved in terms of the risk we're going to address. So upcoming market consultation in that area from us.
Great, thank you. So Dale, now for the loans. So there are two bits. If you can cover loans, I know we're a bit short of time, but also the other one, which is the tough legacy.
Okay, sure, yeah.
Solution issues.
Yeah, so just quickly, just in relation to loans, they're obviously easier to amend in many cases, but not necessarily that easy to amend. And hopefully to date, a lot of provisions have come into the loan documentation over the last little while to give agents certain powers, and there is an architecture around how to switch out a rate. The LMA for the UK has produced some exposure drafts which have multi-currency and other facility sort of documentation which has the relevant fallbacks and some recommended language. They only ever say it's recommended. And certainly they've done some useful market soundings and are publishing some of the more recent facilities that different corporates have done in the UK. And it's not always the same approach, which is, I guess, the point to be made around the related hedge and how it all is clicking together, because the fallbacks and the definitions aren't always perfectly aligned depending on what the banks or the syndicates have decided to do. So that's across the LMA and the ARC experience, in terms of what the LSTA has done in the US as well. In Asia, we have the APLMA, which will draw very heavily, I think, from both of those, I guess, sets of exposure drafts in the other jurisdictions. And then hopefully in the not too distant future, the local committees will come out with a sort of aligned set of recommended provisions for our multi-currency rate agreements, which are governed by Australian law. So the loan market's working on that itself. I guess the main point to make is it hasn't been able to draw exclusively from the work that ISDA has done. So there may be that sort of basis risk issue that opens up in relation to loans, and that will have to be looked at for each deal on a deal by deal basis. Tough legacy is a point I made before, which is just there is a proposal in both the UK and the US to actually bring in some legislation to solve for this. That's not designed to be key sort of way to actually push through this and have it so it affixes all documents. It's designed for the ones that either don't have a fallback or have a fallback that wouldn't work if there was a rate cessation. The UK proposition is to retool LIBOR. It's quite interesting. They're looking to still have it published, but replumb it with some robust methodology, which probably, based on what they've said so far, will look a bit like what is to have as their fallback, which is a compounding RFR with a credit spread adjustment. If they did that, then all of the various documents, including these troublesome notes, the floating rate notes, would then, I guess, be referring to LIBOR, which is then operating in a more robust fashion. They have said, though, that that might be appropriate for that limited set of documentation that just cannot be fixed, but they're not looking to have that as a general fits-all solution, and they're hoping that the market continues to press on with its bilateral amendments and trying to get clauses in the documents themselves. The US has a much bigger problem. They've actually decided to insert fallback provisions by legislative power, if their proposal goes through, into the documentation. So basically to do it with fallbacks rather than sort of retooling the rate. And when I say much bigger problem, they actually have quite a big retail market that refers to US LIBOR, you know, retail mortgages, credit cards, even student loans, all sorts of things which are going to be incredibly difficult to fix. And so, you know, they're actually looking at it from a much bigger picture perspective, which leaves us with the Australian dimension, which is whether or not we should do it. And I think some of the soundings are being taken now by the regulators in some of the industry associations to see if it would make sense for Australia to at least put some powers together so that we could have some legislation like that if it's found that there are some trades which just cannot be addressed, or if we need to, I guess, support local law instruments which are governed by foreign currencies, which those other countries can't impact with their legislation. So it'll be interesting to see if that comes along, but there's a sort of informal consultation happening on that now. But I guess the overall message is people are, in both jurisdictions, being encouraged not to rely on that as a fix-all, as like, you know, a sort of statutory solution that will just amend all documentation to make it work. They're still looking to have all of the institutions look at all of their cash products and their derivatives and amend accordingly. So it's in the docs. So that's something
great
to watch out for.
Thanks, Dale. We only have a few minutes to go and we've got lots of questions. And one question which keeps coming up is the issue about what should especially lawyers do in this sort of preparation for LIBOR. So are there any sort of, Dale, any sort of key things which you think they should consider when advising clients?
Yep. I guess there's two key things. One's legacy and one's forward-looking. Obviously, for forward-looking, everyone needs to remember that there is this discontinuance potentially coming for those two other currencies. For Australian dollar deals, you've obviously got a multi-rate sort of environment, and we're assuming BBSW won't necessarily have those issues. So, you know, but for what's been mentioned about the 30-day rate, you know, obviously in any new deal, there should be a question asked around, you know, what are we doing on the fallbacks? Are we going to have an option for the agent to sort of take us into some fallbacks, or are we going to start now using an architecture which reflects the ISDA protocol, for example, because we know we're hedging? For the legacy transactions, that's a separate idea, like sort of a separate project. The key thing that people need to be doing now is identifying the exposures, which are turning up in all sorts of places. Obviously, it's obvious where you've got LIBOR referenced in a loan or a note, but it's also in discount factors, termination values in leases, all sorts of places across the cash book where, you know, LIBOR may, if it gets discontinued, cause all sorts of unintended consequences. And some of those documents don't have fallbacks at all. So from a lawyer's perspective, if you're in an institution right now, there should already, hopefully, according to some of the recommendations, be a governance process around finding all those exposures, a team and a dedicated sort of budget to try and work out how to start a transition strategy across the book, because the hedge book will need to come with it. You know what I mean? There's actual, on any transaction now that exists already, another question as to what would happen if LIBOR was discontinued on the rate in this set of documents, but as well as that, how else does it get affected and what else is affected? So that's one of the key issues. There's a big conduct risk piece to this, which we haven't mentioned yet, but for all the institutions, Section 912A of the Corporations Act, fairly honestly and efficiently. The customer piece is definitely there to be discussed. The regulators have been quite good on that in terms of some of the letters that are available. So it's worth mentioning, just in terms of how this is played out with each borrower, because just onboarding them onto the protocol or a bilateral version of the protocol will be challenging because it's a very big and complex document. And as everyone has acknowledged, there will be a value shift here. Like when you switch the rate, there will be an outcome for one side or another when they look back and, in retrospect, try and figure out what they might have had otherwise. So I think from the lawyer's perspective, there's obviously a big repapering exercise in the documentation. There's also an exercise of finding all the documentation. And then as well as that, there's just the customer facing piece. There's a big education piece, which I guess in part we're doing today. And certainly there's a lot of operational and IT and procedural things, which John's already mentioned that, the lawyer should probably understand to figure out what the limits are.
Okay, great. Thank you. And how about from your perspective, John? What are customers telling you?
Client side for me, so I actually did quite a lot of work in this area across a number of different firms, and they do vary quite a bit, mostly due to their size and complexity. So if you're dealing with somebody with rather a large and complex business, well, if they didn't start this process 2 years ago, it's a little late now, you might be in a spot of bother. Smaller institutions are just starting to turn their mind properly to this at the moment. The thing they are discovering is that they should have started 2 years ago, like everybody else. So the problem, I think, for most of you, the thing to really concentrate on is what we call direct and indirect references. And Dale mentioned that a moment ago. So a direct reference is that if you do a word search through your documentation, assuming your documentation is stored digitally, which I very much doubt in many cases. So you're going to have to drag it out from under the desk and have a look at it. And where you find LIBOR, that's a direct reference. It's the indirect references that are really problematic. They're in derivative benchmarks. They're in things like return benchmarks for investment companies. There's all sorts of things. They're in intercompany loans, scattered through supply contracts, leases. There are so many references to indirect references to LIBOR and through discounting and sorts of things. So yeah, the only advice I could give in this particular case is that if you haven't really got a very active program of work going on at the moment, then make sure you get one started as soon as possible, independent of how large the organisation is or what you perceive to be your risk.
Okay. Okay, thanks, John. We are unfortunately out of time there, and apologise for those people who asked questions that we didn't quite get to. I'd like to thank Jing, Andrea, John, and Dale for providing a great discussion on LIBOR. And thank you very much, everyone, for attending. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen.